We have the lovely and talented Melvin Bray with us, who does this for a passion and a living. Melvin and I have worked together on several sessions and really long-term projects. And even though really, like probably most of you, I am trying to get up to speed to be a good ally to people who have been historically left out, that I do pay attention to my biases when I write things. I try to write assignments that are neutral. Working with Melvin, he's at least 2 or 3 times said, Jody, what are you thinking? And let me just give you a quick example. One of them, we were working with some women entrepreneurs, and we said, my assignment was, how would this work for women? And the second question, how would this work for women of color? And Melvin said, why are women of color separate? Why aren't they second? Why aren't they first? Or why don't we rewrite that assignment? And I was just so helpful to have his lens on my bias. And so without further ado, I am so happy to introduce to you Melvin, who has really inspired me. Melvin, go to it.
So we sure folk don't need a break before we jump into this.
Or a bridge to jump off of, which
it is such a pleasure to be with you all. I am glad that you are doing this work and taking time to grow your skills as facilitators, and hopefully the things we'll talk about will help with some of that. It was really interesting to try to figure out how best to approach this. I think what we've settled on is I'm going to kind of tee up some things for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then Jody may ask some follow-up questions, and we will definitely open it up to the group, if that is okay with everyone. Can I get a head nod or no? Okay, good. So let's see if I can launch this screen share, if I may. Let's see. Screen share. Let's share that. And let's share. Nope, I shouldn't have shared audio. Let me try that again. Undo that. Yeah. All right. There we go. Now, let me go to present mode there. So, it was trying to figure out how to talk about something like this over in 15 minutes. What to tee up and what not to is some stuff. It was a bit of a challenge. I do training on equity, diversity, and inclusion often, but it's usually longer in nature in terms of the opportunity to participate, and not always particular to people who are improving their facilitation skills. So thinking about this, the way I decided to approach it is I'm going to share with you 4 things or 4 thoughts that I take myself through as I'm preparing for a facilitation event, right? And the first is to foreground assumptions for myself, right? And so in this moment, I want to foreground the assumption that our assumption is that making room for everyone impacted by a thing is a good thing, right? Now, understand what that means. What that means is that there are things that are going to be in scope of that, and there are things that are going to be out of scope for that. right? Like I am centering something particular. I am saying that I am going to talk about, I'm assuming that this is a good thing. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time trying to justify equity, diversity, and inclusion, right? You only have a finite amount of time to work with when you're doing facilitation, right? In this instance, we're talking about 15 to 45 minutes total, right? And there's only so much that can be discussed. And so, recognizing what assumptions you walk into the room with helps you to center the right things, right? To center the right things. And that's the thing that I want you to understand. In your facilitation, you are going to make choices that are going to center some things and decenter others. And there will be people in the room who will demand to be centered, who will demand that their ideas be centered, right? Like they've grown up in societies that center the things that matter to them, right? And so they will approach it without, there won't be anything hostile about the notion that, hey, I want us to talk about this. I want us to think about this. I want us to do this. This is the thing that's important to me. And you have to be able to hold the thing that you and your design team have decided is the focus of your time, so that then you can get to where you're trying to get to, right? So, in this sense, right, the thing I'm focusing is equity, diversity, and inclusion, specifically equity, and we'll talk about that in a second. Specifically equity. And what I want you to understand about it, to frame our entire conversation, is that equity is not an addendum. It's not, we finally realized that this is something we need to pay attention to. So now we're going to pay attention to it. We're going to add it to all the other things we're trying to do. If you approach equity as an addendum, then what ends up happening is that when you run out of time, when you get crunched for either time resources or attention resources, because people only have so much attention they can give to things, then the things that were added on tend to be the first things that you tend to let go, right? Equity is not an addendum. It is the core of all good facilitation, because all good facilitation is about who's in the room and how do we make room for those people to process so that they can find a way forward for the thing they're dealing with. Here's a metaphor that you might want to use to think about this. I garden, and no one thinks of soil as an add-on to a vegetable garden, right? Like no one thinks, oh, yeah, we might want to add some soil, right? Like, no, soil is kind of essential to the thing, to the whole project, right? And even hydroponics, right? Like it's a nifty idea, but most things grow in soil, right? Like so soil equity is the soil in which all good facilitation, anything that's worth facilitating, grows, right? So that's the first. These are some dear people I've done work with. Um, so here's another thought that I usually process through as I'm prepping and preparing and doing initial work around scan, focus, and act, in preparation, and working with a sponsor design team and picking a facilitation team and guiding people through the process of invites, right? Equity is a practice. We are who we practice to be. Now, this happens to be the first line of a book I'm working on. It also is on my website, and so that's why the quotation marks. Equity is a practice. It is not an idea. It is not a feeling. It is not the words we say. It is a daily practice where we make room for people. and we learned what it takes to do that well, to do that artfully, to guide other people in that work. And in doing so, in practicing it in our dealings, we become equitable people, right? So there's a reason that I screw with the order, I mess up with the play with the order that most corporations, in which most corporations talk about the the issues of equity, right? I don't call it DEI, I call it EDI. Now there's a reason for that: equity, diversity, and inclusion, right? The goal is equity. The goal is equity. Now, what do we mean by equity? Well, here's a simple definition. There's more complex, perhaps even more useful definitions, but here's a simple one for us to latch our head on. Equity has to deal with equality of outcomes. So outcome equality, right? Working on those. And then it also has to do with repairing the damage done by our tolerating inequality for any period of time, right? And so when we talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion, we're only really concerned about diversity to the extent that it lends itself to equity. And we're only concerned about inclusion to the extent that it lends itself to equity. Equity is the goal. And in the English language, when something is priority, it's first, right? Like we say it first, right? Like we have this sequence. And the reason is because we think in terms of sequence. We think in terms of 1, 2, 3. We're going to start with 1. And if we run out of time, 3 is going to fall off or 2 is going to fall off, right? So even in the practice of your language, centering what the goal is, equity. Diversity has to do with representation, and that representation matters in order to get us towards a more equitable society, a society that is working on, an organization that is working on equality and outcomes and working on repairing the damage that was done by the toleration of inequality, right? So when we're talking about gender parity, pay parity between genders, right? Like we're talking about saying, what are we going to do about the fact that women historically make less than men? And then what are we going to do about the fact that then what that means is that in terms of wealth, that has had an impact on homes led by women, right? Or in our organization, right? Like that has had an impact on the quality of the work experience for the women that work in our organizations, or the gender nonconforming people that work in our organizations, right? So equity, diversity, inclusion. Inclusion has to do with decision making. Are we bringing people into the decision making that will be a part of creating that equitable society, right? Like part of the reason we end up with inequity is because decisions tend to be limited to a small group of privileged folk or particular categories of identity, right? Decision making tends to be limited there. So how are we bringing people into that decision making? Equity, diversity, inclusion. Within facilitation, these things are always at play in our thoughts, but particularly at this point, as it relates to who is in the room and how are they involved, right? We want to lead in such a way, host in such a way, guide in such a way, advise in such a way that we make sure the right people who are historically left out of certain rooms are in the room, and that they're historically being left out doesn't mean they come in the room timid, or we all preference those who are normally in the room, that they're a part of the decision making, that they're full participants in what's going on. Equity, diversity, inclusion. And so I don't know what just happened there. That's odd. Anyway, so here's another thing I think I often think about, and I've been known to say in meetings. We didn't stumble our way into inequity. We're not going to stumble our way out. We didn't stumble our way into inequity. We're not going to stumble our way out. The only way we are going to move towards equity, diversity, and inclusion is if we get intentional about it, right? It's not just something that will happen into, or that, oh, we don't want to make the people who are normally here uncomfortable, so we aren't going to talk about it. Nope, we got to get intentional. And so I advocate a thing. I use a tool and advocate the use of a tool that I'd like to share with you all. I'm realizing I did not put it in the chat before I got in. Let's see if I can get a hold of it real quick here. I may have to come out of. I may have to.
I can do it, Melvin. I'll put it in the chat. That's
you
fine.
have it there. Oh, great!
Yeah.
I've already come out. If you'll throw that in the chat, that's great. And I'm still going to have to come out because I want to go into this with you, into this document with you. So if you would, please, would you join me in the document that the link that's at the other end of that link there? It's called an intentionality spreadsheet. And it's very simple, right? The idea behind it is, if we want to make sure there are different people in the room, then we have to pay attention to the people we're inviting. So we write their names on a list, right? And then we start to note the specifics about who they are, their identity, right? So let's say your organization has been trying to do some work around racial equity, right? Then knowing the races of the people invited to this design session matters, right? It matters. And if your organization has been trying to work on its gender equity, then knowing how people identify relative to their genders matters, right? It matters. In the Netherlands, it is normally not allowed to ask these characteristics. I'm not asking you to ask. Yes, it is illegal to ask, right? But it is not illegal to be mindful, right? And here's another thing that you have to understand. We can't make everything we can't allow a system that is designed to privilege some and to disadvantage others to then say it is illegal to correct for the ways in which we're advantaging some, right? Like, so we have to be not more determined, but more creative and more thoughtful about how we think about what it means to correct for the disadvantages that we have engineered within our societies, right? And so you can look at me and tell I'm a Black person. That doesn't tell you anything about what that actually means, right? But you know that my heritage is likely something different than yours, right? And that's a starting point, right? That's a starting point. This isn't going out anywhere. This is a private document, right? Like, this is a private document for the planners of a situation, of an event, to make sure that they are mindful about creating the diversity that they say they want. Now, either you're going to be intentional about it or you're not. But if you're not, I guarantee you're going to keep coming up with the same results. Guarantee you that. And anything can go on this document, and anything can be deleted, right? Sometimes I'm working with multi-faith organizations where the diversity they're looking for is actually in the religious traditions that are represented. Because in the United States, Christianity is dominant and Judaism may come in second, right? So being mindful of having Muslims and Sikhs in a room, Buddhists in a room. This matters if you're doing multi-faith justice work, right? It doesn't necessarily matter in your corporation, right? Same thing around sexual identity, right? Like if room, gender identity. If rooms are normally dominated by men, you got to think about what does it mean to have a room to make sure we have women. And if we're going to open it up to women, we need to make sure we're thinking about like gender nonconforming folk, trans folk, and so on. And depending on your context, you can be more explicit or you have to be less explicit. But my point just is what you aren't intentional about, you will not correct, right? This is just fact, right? So I encourage you to the degree that it helps you, right? Intentionality spreadsheet, you're welcome to have it. You're welcome to add to the list, right? Like socioeconomics may matter. The department that someone is in may matter for you as you're planning stuff out. The specific decision-making power may matter, right? Whatever it is, right? Get intentional about it, right? Even if the intentionality is here. Oh, what is profile? That you're welcome to check the drop down list. It was just high profile or low profile. We tend to bring in people who live at a level and function at a level that's very different than the level where a lot of problems happen, right? And so sometimes profile, right? Like, is this person in it for the camera? Or are they the normal, the usual suspects asked into the room versus the people who actually deal with, let's say, police brutality, right? And that's if you happen to be doing something that organizing an event that's for a community that's around an issue like that, right? Like within your organizations, maybe not so, right? Like that might not be of any particular use to you, right? But just letting you see what it means to be intentional. All right, let me go back into my share. And lastly, here's a thought. We are our biases. And what does that mean? That is not meant to be a pejorative. That is just meant to help us see ourselves for how we show up in the world. Whatever historically privileged identity you claim or that claims you, right? So I'll give you a personal example. I'm a man who tries very hard not to be patriarchal in the way I deal with people, and tries very hard not to be paternalistic. But I live in a society that privileges my particular kind of manness, maleness. I speak up for myself. I'm intelligent, educated. I present relatively well, right? Like all of these things really work for me when it comes to being able to get what I need in situations, right? So just because I don't think of myself as being gender biased doesn't mean that gender bias isn't working on my behalf. So I still have to own my maleness in any given situation. So whatever historically privileged identity that you claim or that claims you is the identity or are the identities that you need to be mindful about checking and balancing, right? So when it comes to building out sponsor design teams, I have no problem asking executives or who, because usually they're going to put someone who's in as an executive as a sponsor, and quite often that can be a man. I have no problem asking them to say, hey, with the rest of this team, I want to make sure that it's at worst half male, half female. And if we can do better than that, let's do it. Right. So because I have to be mindful, right? Sponsor when it comes to facilitation teams, right? I know that in certain spaces, or excuse me, because of the history of facilitation, that's where I want to go with this. Because of the history of facilitation and how people get involved in facilitation, how people get involved in business, because of the history of who gets sponsored to be upwardly mobile in organizations and so on and so forth, any corporate space I walk into is going to be white dominant, unless I'm in a country that is not, right? And so the same is true when I'm putting together my team. Most of the people who have those skills are going to be what? So I have to be very intentional to make sure that I diversify my facilitation team, making sure that people of color get more experience, and that organizations where I am, where I go, see the need to mirror what we do, right? And then, of course, the same thing goes with people in the room as well, right? Like being mindful of the same kinds of diversities, particularly the representation that your organization struggles with or has some historic challenges with, right? So with that said, I will open to questions and comments and those kinds of things.
Melvin, maybe I can just start this and ask, when you've had that conversation with your sponsors to say, we need at least half women and half men and maybe some people of color, can you just give us a little example of how that works and how people respond to that, or maybe how you introduce it?
Well, there is no tactic to it, right? Like again, right? Like we're used to kind of euphemisms and kind of dancing around the bush a little bit, right? Like, so I there is no tactic to it. What I do, I learned a long time ago working with young people that you have to earn the right to be heard. And so I go into situations building the rapport that allows me to then get to that point. And I'm a storyteller, story writer by nature. I mean, or even by profession nowadays sometimes. And so I have this idea, former literature teacher as well, right? Like, so I have this idea of what it means to foreshadow, right? So I start dropping hints coming in the door to foreshadow the fact that when we get to this point, there's going to be parts of this conversation that are going to be a little different than maybe how you've approached other things. But I get really clear about what their goals are, what their stated goals, and I help them state their goals. And everyone I've ever dealt with, for the most part, I want to say everyone, but I may be wrong, right? Believes in theory that making room for all different kinds of folks matters, right? There are very few people who will look you in the eye and say, no, I am only concerned for me and people like me, right? Very few people will do that, right? So then how do you use that to your advantage? Didn't we say that what we're really concerned about here is getting input from all over, particularly folk who are impacted by this decision, but normally aren't in this room? Well, if we're going to do that, then we need to be intentional about it. So who's not here? Who's not here? If you invite people into identifying who's not here that's impacted, oh, they do have to work for you.
I'm just going to open it up. I see Jenny has a question about how you can become mindful and intentional about equity and diversity and inclusion in the design if it's not a priority or it doesn't fit the broader theme.
So remember, it's not a theme. Now it is when I go speak places, right? Like when people invite me in, right, and we're talking about equity, yeah, it's a theme, right? But it is not thematic. It is intrinsic, right? It is the soil in which all good things grow. Try to grow anything and not have enough biodiversity. Right? Like if your soil does not support life, things will not grow. And so part of it is the intentionality has to live in you. You have to understand what is acceptable for you. And as a facilitator, you're moving people towards things that you know create the outcomes that they say they want, right? That's why you are there. You're not there just to watch them wander towards it and maybe they'll get it, maybe they won't. Right? Like you're there to guide and support and to make easy. And for you, you have to be convinced this is essential to things being to the outcomes that these people want. One of the things I do for myself, and I'll invite organizations to do the same thing, is I'll invite organizations to name their goal, their targets, right? So for myself, if I get invited to speak somewhere, one of the things I tell them is that I call them conscious. It's my consciousness rider. Is how this originally came up, right? Like so when you do contractual work, right? Like you have contracts and then you have a rider, right? And this became all the rage in Hollywood a couple years back. They called it something different, right? But my consciousness rider. And the idea is if I'm coming to speak somewhere, at least 50% of the folk planning it need to be women. At least 30% of the people planning it need to be people of color. If we're talking about land, Native Americans need to be involved. We have to have a plan for how we're going to function more sustainably so we're not just using up a lot of paper goods that make trash, right? Like this is my thing, right? Like so, and I've had people call, right? Melvin, we'd love to have you, blah, blah, blah. Okay, make sure you can, these things make sense to you and that you can honor these things. If they say yes, we keep talking. If they say no, well, I've been invited to Europe multiple times. When I hit them with at least 30% of the people involved at every level, either on the planning, at the space, on the stage, need to be people of color. I've had them say back to me, oh, well, only 10% of Britain is people of color. That may be true, but colonization did a number on them and the rest of the world. So we're going to aim for something more than proportional, right? I know there is science behind a critical mass being about 30%, right? And if a critical mass is about 30%, anything below that is just people you're being nice to. Right? So yeah, I hope some of that answered the question.
There's another question from Claudia about where does justice fit into this? And she says something about—
You don't have to type the questions. Turn on the mic.
Tell them. You tell them, Melvin, exactly. Claudia, ask them what your question is.
Yes. So I wanted to ask, where does justice fit into this? Because I heard also about the Jedi or the DIE. So all of the three plus the J. Yeah, exactly. So that's what I would
So
like.
first thing is these are all terms that we use where there is no set dictionary as people do this work. So my experience, because of the places where I do most of my design work, I do most of my design work in justice movement spaces. I do some support work in corporate spaces too, right? But I do most of my design work in corporate movement, in justice movement spaces. And justice is the general term that has purchase in those spaces for what we mean by equity in other spaces that don't want to necessarily be associated with the language of justice. And even in the justice world, in movement spaces, we talk about equity all the time. There's been a recent kind of push to say, hey, that language may not be inclusive of everything we want to be about here. And so then, they start to add on more words and stuff like that. But that's kind of just a liberal tendency to, before people even catch a thing, to be on to the next thing, right? Like, we play with language and we tend to be smart and all that kind of stuff. And we forget sometimes that the goal isn't to get all the right language. The goal is to do better. Mm-hmm. That's that last slide. Do better. Don't just think, feel, and speak better. And so if we're really after justice, we're after this notion of how do we identify and correct for outcome inequalities, right? Outcome inequalities. That outcome is a big word. Inequity is about persistently inequitable outcomes that over time, regardless of what we say we're doing, particular groups of people have particular outcomes that are often different than these other people over here, right? So it's about correcting that and repairing the damage that's been done by allowing those inequalities to persist.
I mean, one of the things, and then I'll get to you, Adrian, that I realize, and I've had the great fortune of being in the halls of power, of actually being a lever in the halls of power as a facilitator. I have choices where I'm going to push my hand and reach back and who I'm going to bring in with me. So it's not only for me about the participants. For me, it's about who is on my team. Who am I inviting in to be a part and to learn and to understand the way that the power structures work? So
yes, that is so important, right? Like, so I use language of privilege as just kind of a catch-all for different kinds of privilege, right? Like, but privilege can be money, privilege can be decision-making power, privilege can be political power, pulling those levers of power in political spaces, in governmental spaces. Privilege can be just being presumed innocent.
Thank you.
Right?
Jason has a question, if I could.
Jason, please jump in. I saw a hand.
I have a question too.
Okay, so let's do Jason and then let's do Adrian.
Thanks, Melvin. Thanks very much for the conversation. Like, it's remarkable to be hearing that. The question that I have is, I guess it's sort of seeking advice. When we're doing diversity, equity, diversity, and inclusion work in sort of spaces, how do you help groups that might have I don't mean to put this derogatorily, but the patina of diversity, but maybe not the intent. So if I can give you an example, I've come from a corporate context, and if you walk into a meeting, people tick off yep, we've got Raj here, we've got the 50% female, we've got someone who's from Aboriginal descent, etc. But we've all been to Melbourne Business School, and we've all grown up in the same neighborhoods, all gone to the same high schools. how do we help that sort of culture understand that yeah, there's another click down we might need to go, like in that sort of context?
I love it. I love it that you're thinking deeper. So I don't have answers, but I can give a bit of a response. One is, and I know this wasn't like a hallmark of the description you gave, but I do want to name this for other folk, and that is that where there's one, there should definitely be two. One of the intentionalities I bring into any space is no one who has an identity that matters to them should be able to look around and not see someone who shares that identity. Particularly, and particularly, we're talking about classes of people, and particularly the classes that are either advantaged or disadvantaged. I'm not talking about redheads being able to see other redheads, right? Like that's not what this is, right? Blue-eyed folks and green-eyed folks being able to see other green-eyed folks, right? Like I'm talking about, right? But no one should bear the burden of being the only, being the token, right? So one of the ways you help with what you're talking about is by increasing the critical mass, Jason, and that's a simple way, right? Like it's a step ahead of explaining to people why it's important, or that we need to go a deeper level, just by saying, hey, no one should be the only in the room. How do we change that? And then once you've increased the critical mass, then you get to then that makes other conversations easier, right? Like, that's when you say, so how do we make decisions? I'm the facilitator here, and I realize that the way we make decisions is often by consensus that is dominated by the same folk. Or the decisions are actually made in the agenda. And when we come together in the organizing of the agenda, and when we come together, then there's this kind of ceremony we do, but the decisions have already been decided, right? That is not inclusive, right? And if we're going to get towards equity, right, if it's going to be something different, and part of it, Jason, is you have to be willing to name what is. Right? Like you said, you didn't want to sound derogatory. So figuring out what that positive is, or building the comfort within yourself to say the derogatory thing, to say, hey, this only goes so far and we want to get further. So how do we do that? Right? Like, and so if that's the case, I have a couple different ideas about how we get some decision making, how we might do consensus that makes those people who feel insecure about being in this, who may feel insecure about being in this space, or may just not have built up the same level of comfort, or they may not have the same level of power because of their position. I have some ideas about how to get them involved and allowing their contribution to guide the conversation, right? So I think it's in those functional ways, Jason, and not every functional choice has to be explained for its equity merit. That's another thing. I think we owe explanation to folk who prove themselves to use explanation well, right? But folk that are just going to organize against you, then why? This is what we're doing. I kind of have the marker. I can do that. You ain't got to tell them that, but I'm saying just thinking that. Adrian. And then
we have just about 3 minutes left, just to let you know.
So,
okay.
And then Ellen.
I think my question is going to link to one of the aim we have, which is planet-centered design. And I understand the rationale for including diversity, but at the same time, we are having to encourage commonalities. So going from a super open to diversity, but then what is making us a collective? Where is the sense of belonging among all those diversity? How do we bring commonality? And so I wonder if you have techniques for that, because otherwise we could go from diversity to aggressivity toward each other, so, and we cannot do that. We cannot allow this, because we are going toward a threat which is to our human race existence. So how do we find the commonalities among the diversities?
Yes. So, wow, there's so much there. Let me see if I can get right to perhaps the key. So the first thing, Adrian, is we have to acknowledge that the hostility, the aggressiveness, exists pre-diversity. It was that aggressiveness that actually drove diversity out, right? Because we live on a planet that is 75% people of color. So how do we ever get, and the only place where that's not true is on the European continent, right? So how did we ever get to this place where somehow it's hard to even see the diversity if it wasn't for the fact that colonization is foundationally violent, it's foundationally hostile, right? And so if we can acknowledge that, right, if we can avoid starting at secondly or thirdly, if we can avoid starting with the idea that somehow it's the remembering that there are other people here who are impacted by things, right, that creates the hostility, then what that allows for us to do as facilitators is to not center that notion, right? And then in terms of what we can do, that has a lot to do with the functionality, right? Like it's a lot of the other things that we already do, right? But because we're doing it towards an equitable end, we're saying, hey, just like if we're in a room of people of all the same nationality, we would still do the work of making sure those quiet people get heard, right? So then we're doing that same work. We're just doing the work with saying, oh, those people who are usually left out of decision making are now going to be heard, right? Like, but it's the same functional tools. It's our basic facilitative process, right? Another part of it too is it's about to Jody's point. It's about diversifying our team in such a way that they help us see our own blind spots with how we lend ourselves to continuing to privilege some and advantage some while disadvantaging others, even within our work of facilitation, right? And there's 1,000 other things we could talk about, but don't have time. Ellen, but Adrian, let's talk. I mean, by all means, feel free. I mean, like I am available to you all. I'll extend myself in that way. Please feel free to connect. And if there's anything in particular I can help you with, I will do my best to do so. Ellen, I want to get you in.
Thank you, Melvin. I guess this is kind of a question and kind of a statement, but I was thinking when you were talking about bringing the people who are most impacted by an issue in to make sure they're decision makers, what I see most often that even good intention facilitation tends to forget is bringing those people in to actually define the problem.
Yes, indeed.
What I was working on a project where white corporate America defined the problem and then brought a bunch of people of color in supposedly to solve it. And the people of color were like, that is not our problem. Our problem is not that we need more data. Our problem is that we need money to actually, create solutions to the things that we've known for generations. So I guess as you were talking about that, I was thinking about the stages in the process and where it tends to most likely to be forgotten.
Yes. I mean, you are exactly right. I mean, even like the construction of diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI, we're going to start with the thing that we're most comfortable, that the existing power dynamics is most comfortable with. Okay, we can have some different faces, right? Like we can have some different faces. And if that's all we get to, oh, well,
right.
And you're exactly right that it comes up so often in the defining the problem, particularly around this money. So one of the things that just kind of, again, colonization did, was it sent Europeans around the world who became experts in everybody else, right? Like the whole idea of anthropology is this, right? You become an expert in everyone else. And what that means is there is inherent suspicion about anybody else's expertise in themselves, right?
Melvin, I need to really slowly cut it off. I'm so sorry.
So yes, there you go.
Can we just give a giant twinkle for Melvin? I will, Melvin, also, if you want to send me the links to your books, or I'm happy to provide that to people as well. And thank you so very much for that. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Can I offer an exercise to the group that they might want to do just in their own private practice around things?
Sure.
Here's something to start playing with, start playing with that intentionality spreadsheet around, right? Give yourself a facilitation topic, gathering topic, whatever it is. Make a list of 20 historic figures. And you might want to make that list of 20 historic figures from different backgrounds first. Then give yourself a topic and figure out how you would build out the room for that topic using those figures. And maybe think about how the room changes, how the room might change, and the order of your invitee list might change if the topic's a different topic. And if you ever do take time to do an exercise like that, you will begin to see in a tangible way how thinking about who's in the room and who's not in the room and being intentional around it matters. Blessings. Everybody have a great day.
Melvin, fantastic.
Thank you.
We're going to take a 10-minute break now, but during that break, I would like you to reflect on what you've learned from Melvin just now, from the family holidays, the Scan Focus Act discussion, and how that might impact the challenge that you're bringing in. So we'll see you back here in 10 minutes sharp, which is pretty much a little bit before 10 after the hour.